Carol. I'm looking forward to this presentation. I have some slides to share with you. So I'm going to share my screen now, and then we'll be able to go through the slides. So just bear with me for a second. And I should note that this is a brand new computer, so anything could happen. Here's hoping. Okay, Carol, I'm having trouble getting to my first slide on this screen.
Okay, so let's back out and do it one step at a time.
Okay.
So stop sharing your screen.
Yep. Pause share.
Okay,
Or
and
stop.
go back to the working view of your slides where it shows all your slides.
Yep.
Okay. Are you on number one? Are you clicked on number one?
No, I'm not.
Yeah, click on number one.
I can't see number one.
Do you have the row of slides on the left-hand side?
No, that's the problem.
Okay, so go to the view of your slides on your top bar.
I don't have a top bar.
Oh, what's happened?
I don't know.
Just for fun, hit escape.
Okay. Okay, I see them.
Okay.
Over on the side here.
So it could have been the view that you chose when you shared your screen. So you've got the working copies up right now, right?
Yes.
Perfect. So let's try sharing your screen again.
Okay. Okay, share screen. Yes.
There we go.
Okay,
so up on the top taskbar there where it says slideshow, kind of in the middle at the top.
Yep.
Yeah. And then you want to start your first slide.
Yeah, my first slide is up now.
Yeah, press that.
Okay, very good.
There you go.
Now I don't see how I do the next slide.
You just click on the slide.
Okay, great. Okay, so here we go. As you can see, my name is Ardyth Cooper, and I'm from Snuneymuxw on my mother's side. But before we start the actual presentation, I want to thank my cousin Dave for doing the land acknowledgement to Snuneymuxw territory. And I also want to share with you how good I feel when I hear such an acknowledgement of our traditional and unceded territory by politicians and by ordinary people. In these days of COVID, these gestures of compassion and respect lift up my spirits. I've been heartened over the past few months to hear our health minister, Adrian Dix, acknowledge the traditional territory each and every time he opens a coronavirus briefing. It just makes me feel good to have that compassion on display. My husband and I have often talked about what else we could do to enhance this show of respect and solidarity. And it's my hope that we have the opportunity perhaps to discuss that later on in the questions. I also want to thank my cousin Dave and the Gabriola Arts Council, that's wrong, for the opportunity to take part in this presentation on Gabriola Island. And forgive me if I mispronounce this, Snuneymuxw, is that right, Dave? I also want to recognize and thank the other speakers who are from Snuneymuxw, Geraldine Manson, Bo Wagner, and Dave, for including me in this series. Some of you may know me as Ardyth Cooper. I'm also Kamchatka. This is the name given to me when I was a child by my paternal grandmother, as I was her first grandchild. I'm deeply honored as it was her name as well. I now share that name with my cousin and close friend, Deborah Lazar. I'll speak more about Grandma Sue later in the presentation. I want to start by giving you an idea about who I am and where I'm from. The purpose of this talk is to share with you my personal perspective as an Indigenous woman and on some of the issues we face today. But I do stress, I don't hold elected office in Snuneymuxw or any other government. This is strictly my personal view, informed by my experiences, many experiences, and my observations. I'm also talking about myself, and that's not easy for me, as I'm essentially a shy person, and I hope you will forgive my self-consciousness. My history is that I'm from Tsauk on my father's side, who also has lineage in Songhees and Pachidot, and we have relatives in Port Alberni. Let me place those for you. Tsauk is in Souk, outside of Victoria. Songhees is around Esquimalt. Pachidot is in Port Renfrew. And of course, everybody knows where Port Alberni is. My Snuneymuxw heritage on my mother's side comes through Andrea Wesley, as she then was, and she came from Snuneymuxw. When I was a child, we would come up here to visit my grandpa, Andrew Wesley, here in Cedar. Not very often. In those days, it was a long, long way and very expensive to get up here. Dave Bodaly and I are cousins, and lucky for me, Dave is a genealogical expert. Over recent years, he has delighted me with being able to shed light on my mother's family, and I look forward to learning more about that side of the family. I am blessed with a fair memory, and I recall my mother mentioning her family in Cowichan, Dot, Seashell, and with the assistance of my cousin, I hope to continue to inform myself on that side of the family. I feel as though today I'm confronting 50 years of my experience. So I'm bringing you back to the very beginning when I grew up in Tsauk, Souk, 20 miles outside of Victoria. As I was growing up, I recall about 33 people lived in our tiny community in Souk on southern Vancouver Island, so way down in the other end. Now we have over 200 people. Largely as a consequence of the meat of this conversation, which is about the Indigenous women being excluded from being on reserve. My father attended residential school. My mother attended day school. I myself and my cousins were among the first generations to attend public school. Linda, Karen, Pat, Janie, Willow, and my cousin Andy all attended school in the mid-50s, late 50s. And many of those cousins were considered non-status Indians because of the operation of the Indian Act. I'll expand on this further in the body of my comments. I've come to learn in later life the rifts this caused in our communities and the hard feelings that continue to this day by some being considered Indians and some not being considered Indians. And also to provide you some context, at that time when we were growing up, there were Indian schools and Indian hospitals back in the 50s. I remember visiting my mom's dad, my grandfather, from here in Cedar, in the Indian hospital in Chemainus, and not realizing at the time that this is where some of our people had to go when ill. And in case, excuse me, and in case you believe that this is a thing of the past, I just received a note from one of my fellow artists in South Dakota that her tribe has had to move COVID patients out of state, though it appears there is room in the local hospitals. So we haven't crossed all of those hurdles as of this time. While I knew all of this in retrospect, I realized some instances I was tolerated rather than welcomed. For example, when my father tried to assert his Aboriginal right to carry on his fishery as formerly, he was charged with fishing inappropriately. In the court case R versus Cooper, George, and George, he was found guilty and I believe fined. And let me tell you, I heard about that in school. There were other instances where a First Nations kid, an Indian kid, was not welcome. I recall one friend in high school being told that he couldn't be my friend because it would be bad for the family reputation. Now, putting all of that aside, in my family, the community work was important. Both my mother and my father were elected chiefs, Indian Act chiefs, in our small community. And why, might you ask, do I use the term Indian Act chiefs? It's because the Indian Act is a piece of legislation that provides for how Indians live our lives, including how we elect our leadership. My father carried out hereditary responsibilities in our communities as well, passed to him from Quisto, my grandfather from Pachidad, Grandpa Charlie. So in terms of, let me see if I've got another slide here. Oh yes, this is a picture of my Grandma Sue, Kamchatlia, and I thank Dave Bodaly for the picture. She was a very well-known and well-loved person in our community. And I was speaking at another conference, and one of the participants there noted that Grandma Sue got me a husband because it was she who introduced me to my current husband, Dave. My current husband, Dave. Here are some of her baskets. She was a prolific basket weaver, bead maker, and knitter. Here's a picture of me. I don't take pictures very often, so here's a very rare and small photograph of myself. Okay, I want to put this in the context of what was going on at that time. Ultimately, I'm going to be discussing discrimination under the Indian Act, but in order to understand what was happening at that time, I think it's pertinent to talk about the white paper policy. Jean Chretien introduced this in 1969, and he thought it would be a great thing. However, there was a great deal of blowback for him on that. During this time in 1969, I was a young woman and I was interested in fashion. However, the formation of what was to become the Union of British Columbia Indian Chiefs was to refocus my interests. Let me explain. In 1969, Chretien issued a white paper which essentially promised to do away with the Indian Act. By that, we could all just be white people, just like everybody else. This was met with uproar across the country from First Nations leaders. And I think that it's important to consider the state of Indian country back then. There was and still is poverty, a lack of housing on our reserves. Men were working in fishing and logging in my community. Women were primarily homemakers. We were just allowed to go to the white schools. We had only recently received the right to vote. Racism thrived. Signs were up in restaurants, for example, that prohibited dogs and Indians. Only recently were we allowed to hire lawyers. And yet magically, we are all going to become white people with the stroke of a pen. At that time, there was an amazing writer, many of you may have heard of, by the name of Harold Cardinal. Harold Cardinal lambasted the Indian Act by saying, "We do not want the Indian Act retained, not because it's a good piece of legislation, it isn't. It is discriminatory from start to finish, but it is a lever in our hands and an embarrassment to government, as it should be. No just society, and no society, even with pretensions of being just, can long tolerate such a piece of legislation, but we would rather continue to live in bondage under the inequitable Indian Act than surrender our rights, which are sacred. At any time the government wants to honor its obligation to us, we are more than ready to help devise a new Indian Act. That was in 1969 in his book, The Unjust Society. Now, from my perspective, as I say, I was a teenager. I liked fashion. I had no idea, other than an occasional poke at school about being Indian, that there was any strife. However, we all have foundational moments, and the formation of the Union of British Columbia Indian Chiefs was one for me. My longtime girlfriend from the community, Linda Bristol, George then, and I attended the first ever meeting of the Union of BC Indian Chiefs as the youngest delegates. This experience brought with it some awareness of the issues of the day, but as you can imagine, it was the tip of the iceberg. I met many leaders, George Manuel, Joe Mathias, Philip Paul, to name but a few. Mostly I mention men here, but later women were to enter politics and become close friends of mine from all over the province. Chief Mathias and I were to become close friends during the time I resided in the mainland. Let me just push on here. George Manuel, his book, published many years ago in the 70s, has recently been republished. And while I'm mentioning books, I want to commend to you the two Robert Joseph books, easy to read, used for fact checking. Paul Tennant's book, Aboriginal People in Politics, Sheila Rogers, among others, who wrote Speaking My Truth, Reflections on Reconciliation Residential School, and Thomas King's The Inconvenient Indian. I'm just showing you some slides of those publications. In addition, 30 years ago now, Cheryl Brooks wrote the amazing anthology Celebrating Our Survival. And I just want to say, Cheryl, if you're listening, it's time to republish that. It's time to update it. After this, as a teenager, and after this week-long trip and conference, I returned to Sioux as a teenager, working at the Hudson's Bay Company, though at that time I was unaware of its colonial background. As a teenager, I was oblivious to such things. Later, I also worked for the Provincial Museum as a tour guide in my teens, met my first boyfriend, who was an aspiring artist at the time, and discovered my lifelong avocation as in heritage. However, there was an awareness of racism and inherent inequality that planted a seed in me. And I value the experience of going to that first ever Union of BC Indian Chiefs meeting simply because it was possible. Without that, I would not have become a person interested and dedicated to equality seeking as I became later in my life. The major impact on my life as an Indigenous woman was the Indian Act. And as people of a certain age, some of us may recall the potential for change we felt in the 60s and 70s. As a young woman blessed with new experiences such as the eye-opening white paper, it was also a time when I became aware of the basic inequality towards women. Of course, there was racism inherent in the Indian Act and discrimination affected by some even more deeply. I will refer to Section 12 of the Indian Act, which dealt with membership in a First Nation. And in case some of you are unaware of why it angered us so greatly, I'll just itemize some of the things that occurred. If a status Indian woman, which I was when I was 17, married a non-Indian or a non-status Indian, she lost her status. She was not allowed to live in her community, to inherit property, confer status to her children, to raise her family in the community, to be buried with her ancestors, to share in the benefits of her First Nation. She could not access education funds, and these are just a few of the deficiencies in the Indian Act. As a teenager, I was not much interested in getting married in the near future, but what was particularly irksome was that the provisions also included that my brother, could marry a non-Indian, and he could retain his status. He would confer his status as an Indian to his non-Indian wife and their children. And this was the way it had been going on for years. So there were generations of people affected by these provisions. Many people appeared to just accept that this is the way things were and would always be. In fact, and this is a personal perspective, some male leaders actively argued against any changes, arguing that cultural norms now existed and could not be changed. Or in some cases in Alberta, with the oil-rich bands, there were stories shared that indicated the male leadership did not want women returning, as that would mean diminished oil money for them. Now, this might seem all pretty unreal. So I want to share with you an example of the complexity brought about by the Indian Act provisions. And I'll have to ask you to stay with me because this can seem a bit overwhelming. We're going to call this Susie's story. And there are 5 main characters: Susie and her son, Dick, and her close girlfriend, Kathy, also a First Nations woman, and her son, Henry, as well as a baby girl we'll call Tracy. Susie married young, 17 years old, and she married a non-Indian and had a child we're calling Dick, and then divorced soon after. She was a single mom, not educated. She could not live in her community because despite all appearances, she was not an Indian. Life was hard for a single mom. She was living off reserve and trying to make a life for herself. She becomes close friends with Kathy and her son Henry, who's close to the same age as Dick. Kathy tragically dies. Her son Henry goes to live with Susie and Dick, perhaps with visits to his dad, Henry Sr. And in my family, and in lots of First Nations families, this happens all the time. There's people who are your brothers and sisters and cousins, and it's a fairly fluid situation. Susie falls in love with another man. She becomes pregnant by a non-status Indian. So now the dilemma is she is unmarried, she has no status, and she's pregnant. What to do? Encouraged by her friends and her bossy big sister, Susie enters into a marriage of convenience with Kathy's former husband. This would be Henry's father. So Susie is taking care of the child Henry, and she enters a marriage of convenience with Henry's father, who's also Henry. And she does this just before the birth of her baby girl, Tracy. Now, Susie, according to the law, the Indian Act, Susie has gained status with her marriage to a status Indian. And she now can raise her family of 3 in her community. This is but one story. There are many more out there. In fact, I would love to do a study of the women who have jumped through hoops in order to retain their status. But there's a final irony, and that is Susie has jumped through all of these hoops so her second child would have status, though her brother Dick still did not have status. In reality, however, Dick was not legally Tracy's brother. Rather, Henry was legally her brother, despite no blood linkage. So that's the Indian Act. And as I say, this is just one story that we have about the complexity of the Indian Act. And if it's confusing to follow, imagine what it's like to try to live with that. Okay. A challenge in fighting these issues was that there was no ready infrastructure to fight such inequality. In our communities, our band councils were bound by the strictures of the Indian Act. Remember my comment about the Indian Act chiefs? They were bound by Indian Act rules and Indian Act programs focused on actions on the reserve. Eventually, there was funding through the Secretary of State for umbrella organizations, but these organizations had another focus. In British Columbia, for example, there was land claims, an organization around that. And these organizations, in my view, soon became sounding boards for whatever issue government wanted to speak to Indians about, be it a fishing issue or any other issue that was front and center at that time. Project funding was available for organizations such as the Indian Homemakers of British Columbia or the Native Women's Association of Canada, but this was limited funding for the whole country or for the whole province. Plus, this was before the internet, so communication was difficult. We would read newsletters, an occasional item in the major newspapers. So we knew of the Laval and Bedard cases, which were happening back east. They were court challenges to the discriminatory sections of the Indian Act. But coordinating efforts across the country was challenging. And the women who were concerned enough to fight about this were all volunteers. There were also by this time awesome numbers of women leaders integrated and working in the mainstream organizations. But as I say, there was a lot to focus on in the mainstream organizations as well. And in my view, there wasn't necessarily an appetite in those mainstream organizations to take on dealing with the status issues of Indian women. Our women were adversely affected by this displacement in many ways. According to the Native Women's Association of Canada, these systemic issues have directly caused poor health and mental health, economic insecurity, homelessness, lack of justice, addiction, and low educational attainment for Aboriginal women and girls, placing them in precarious situations where the risk of violence is greater. There was a local organization called the Professional Native Women's Association, whose aim was to assist in education and the development of our workforce. However, every woman, every Indigenous woman, knew of someone who was personally affected by this Indian Act. So it was natural that our focus was split. We knew we were supposed to be working on personal development and employment opportunities, but your heart and soul, your guts said, hold on, this isn't right. In fact, I remember talking to a man I was at school with, and he tried to put me off by saying something about my passion for this issue. We were talking about Section 12(1)(b) of the Indian Act. And I said, well, how do you know I have passion for that? And he said to me, Ardyth, I'm standing next to you. That's how enthusiastic our discussions would become. By luck and happenstance, I ended up being the president of this organization, the Professional Native Women's Association, and we are able to participate in lobbying efforts to change the Act. We appeared before every parliamentary committee we could. By hook or by crook, we wrangled our way to Ottawa to meet with parliamentarians. Or when the minister of the day was out in Ottawa here, we would meet with him, because the ministers were all men at that point. Luckily, the feminist community saw and supported our plight. Our membership was frequently asked to speak on the subject or to address annual meetings, International Women's Day rallies, and share our plight. At every turn, the feminist community was with us. Well, almost every turn. I don't recall getting much traction in the mainstream Indigenous organizations up until the time when our big boost came with the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Section 15(1) says every individual is equal before and under the law and has the right to the equal protection and the equal benefit of the law without discrimination, and in particular, without discrimination based on race, national or ethnic origin, color, religion, sex, age, mental or physical disability. As you can imagine, this was a boon to the move to deal with the discriminatory sections of the Indian Act. Section C31 was the legislation to remove discrimination from the Indian Act and make it consistent with the Charter. However, that bill in reality did the bare minimum. The discrimination continued as many of the children were cut off from membership by the bill. So that was called second generation cutoff. So what the Bill C31 did was it did a superficial sweep of who was and was not an Indian and sort of made preparation to reinstate some of the women who had been disenfranchised. However, that was not necessarily the case for their children. In addition, the the cat just showed up. In addition, the Indian Act had been a patchwork of various different solutions to dealing with particular situations. So there was not one consistent group of women or red ticket holders was one label, and a variety of different patchworks were attributed to various people. So just one blanket piece of legislation was not going to be sufficient to cure all of the ills. So the discrimination continued to the many of the children that were cut off from membership by provisions of C31, and consequently, another remedy was required. And that ended up being the work of Sharon McIver. Sharon McIver is a lawyer here in British Columbia, and she was reinstated as an Indian, but her son was not, as I recall. And Sharon actually worked for a period of time with an organization that I was also a part of called West Coast Leaf, the Women's Legal Education and Action Fund. The McIver versus Canada was about gender discrimination in Section 6 of the 1985 Indian Act. Section 6 is what they called the act after they removed Section 12(1)(b). Sharon McIver, a woman who regained status after the passing of C31, was not able to pass those rights on to her descendants in the same way a man with status could. In her case against the federal government, the BC Supreme Court ruled in 2007 that Section 6 did in fact deny McIver's equality rights under the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms in response to, the cat's here, in response to gender discrimination in the Indian Act. And they are still ironing out the complexities of that. Now, all of this immaturity makes me think that I probably would have just told the Indian Act to go jump in the lake, but they were evolving times, and these issues of discrimination hung over our heads. Dave's rescuing the cat. Thank you, Dave. As a consequence of this work in the whole area of discrimination against women, I became fascinated with the area of equality rights. And my work was previously in First Nations organizations, but with the experience I gained, I became also involved in feminist organizations. I've already mentioned Professional Native Women's Association. When the Women's Legal Education and Action Fund was formed in April of 1985, just as the Indian Act was going through its first remedy, I became involved in LEAF because of the charter challenges. Given that in 1982, the Canadian Bill of Rights, Charter of Rights and Freedoms came into being, by 1985, there was an appetite to make that charter real. And the way that this was attacked was by bringing up cases of inequality before the Supreme Court and sort of flesh out the charter. So it wasn't just a piece of paper with words written on it. It became something more substantial. And so our job was to bring the charter to life through charter challenges and interpreting the law as a means to bring equality. The other facet of the women's community I became involved with was an organization called Winning Women. And this was an organization to bolster getting more women to participate and to be elected in politics. And what that really means to me is to get more women to be lawmakers. So on one hand, in my view, we had women helping to make laws which were more equitable. And on the other hand, we had the charter challenges going forward to the inequitable laws, so that in essence, we were, taking a two-fisted approach at creating a more just, equal, and caring society, in my view. And the one thing I haven't mentioned is that it doesn't happen very often, but after having participated in a number of forums, organizations, volunteer activities, I was very lucky in that I was asked to work with the Canadian Advisory Council on the Status of Women in the early 90s. And it's one of those rare occasions when voluntary efforts were rewarded with an actual paying job, which doesn't happen very often, as any of you volunteers know. I have indicated that the political development of organizations post-white paper policy included some women. In the 50 years since then, there's been a dramatic increase in the number of Indigenous women holding office. Over that time, I've been privileged to know many of the leaders from all over the province and country, both male and female. To me, it's interesting how strong the bonds become, as we may see each other only a few times a year at a conference or a meeting in Vancouver, but become incredibly close. Mind you, with COVID, who knows when we'll have the next conference or whatever. I think that closeness probably comes from similarities of background and experience combined with working together hard on specific issues. Naturally, I am biased. These are my friends, but over the years, I have observed when the hard questions are up for debate at the big meetings, we could be in a situation where the discussion could go round and round and round and seemingly going nowhere. To my way of seeing it, resolution and common sense will pull through as the women leaders speak up. One could almost believe it was orchestrated, but one by one I have witnessed a female voice from Fort Nelson or from Tunukha territory in Cranbrook to Cowichan and the Chilcotin and back to Tunukha and to the New Channels territory, to Tawasin and to Tsleil-Waututh, bring the dialogue back to concrete, common sense solutions. This is the role of Indigenous women. And not just those tables. I've witnessed the Tunukha at St. Eugene's Mission turned their former residential school and a building that was frankly a wreck into a signature golf course, casino, and hotel and moneymaker in their community. Tawasin has created modern-day treaty. And during a time when I was working with Professor Paul Tennant for the Drury Commission, we talked about putting our stamp on institutions or creating linkages. And I think that's what we are seeing right now. Let me give you an example. I was joking with some friends about the cool club these days being the universities with their new chancellors. Sadly, the super cool and brilliant Louise Mandel has moved on from VIU, but her spot as chancellor at VIU is being filled by Judith Sayers. At UBC, we have Stephen Point, Kim Baird as the new chancellor at Kwantlen in the Valley, and Sheila Rogers maintains the position at UVic. So the reason I mention these institutions is because, in my view, that is the way we continue to not just reconcile, but in a sense to weave our perception, our worldview into the mainstream institutions. Now, I have some other thoughts, but should we need it, but I think this might be a good time to stop for questions. And Dave, I believe you were going to mention your presentation next week before we have questions.
Yes, good afternoon. Yes, wonderful words, Ardyth. I really appreciate that being part of it. And next week, I'm going to be speaking again from my shop here at Bevan Park. And behind me, I don't know if I can see it with the, no, I guess I can't. I thought I could see the computer or the background behind me because it's all set up with the cedar hats I weave and with the canoe that Bo had carved. And so I'll show us some things about that next week. So just a little bit of information about it. Awesome. Thanks, Ardyth.
That's wonderful. We do have a question. Heather Menzies was wondering if you could repeat the name of a book, and it was a female author. And I think it was at the end of your list that you were talking about. And I believe you might have requested that she do an update. Oh, you're on mute, Ardyth.
How did I get on mute? Yes, it's actually a girlfriend of mine. She and I have been talking about this for a while. It's Cheryl Brooks. 30 years ago, Heather, she did a compilation of articles for BC Studies, and it's called Celebrating Our Survival. It was a special edition.
Did anyone have any questions for Ardyth at this point? Please add them into the chat box. I know it takes a minute or two to type it in, but that was a lot of information. Thank you, Ardyth. It was very dynamic, and I know I have a lot of heavy thoughts right now about what you shared with us. Louise Amour, not a question, but a big capital B, capital I, capital G appreciation.
Thank you.
Thank you, Louise. I have a question. I was going to wait until the end, but it's something that came to mind. Was what is your advice for young Indigenous women today?
Well, from what I see, I don't think they need any advice. There's quite a dynamic crew out there. I think that what's most important is they just follow their dream. Go where their interest is. And as I spend time with my nieces, I have a very wonderful young niece who has just had some surgery, and I thought, okay, she'll be subdued for a while as she recovers from the surgery. But from what I see, she just keeps on going and going and going. And she's chosen not to go into university or whatever, but she's chosen another profession, and she's just going like gangbusters. The same with a generation younger than her. I think that the thing that's so exciting is just to see how, an 8-year-old gets it right away. She just figures it out right away. So I think just following their passion is the way to go. And I suppose, the other credit has to be given to the people who are raising these dynamic young women, because that's where the credit goes, is that those parents aren't scared to have their daughters seek out whatever avenues they can. And there's a lot of support. I myself was I benefited from a lot of mentors when I was doing voluntary work for the provincial government as the chair of the British Columbia Heritage Trust, one of the deputy ministers took me under his wing, and we met for lunch every month and sort of figured out our path together, and that was a tremendous plus for me. In addition, I have the group of eight, a group of 8 friends that I call on all the time when I need guidance or a sounding board or whatever. And that that group of people ranges from an actor, a fashion designer, a tribal chief, a lawyer, a fundraiser, a CBC radio announcer, another girlfriend here in Gabriola, and my other friend Cheryl Brooks in Duncan. So at any time, the group of 8 can sort of help me out, and it's a relief in my life to have those good friends who always have my back. I also had a very close relationship, as I mentioned, when I lived in Vancouver with the late Chief Joe Mathias, who, and I don't know that I was necessarily his intellectual equal. However, Joe and I would spend time together, several times together every week. And I think I was more like a sounding board in his life. So he would talk about various things that were engaging him, intriguing him. And I think that I had the opportunity just to give him some feedback, or maybe just have somebody listen to what he was saying was of benefit. So I think sounding boards are also good. I think having a sounding board, a safe place where you can put out ideas, is a beneficial thing.
Thank you. I have a couple of comments and a question. So Michelle Denis, thank you. That was very informative, and I too have much to consider now. I look forward to future conversations. Heather Menzies adds, I also loved all that you shared because it was both personal and political. I particularly like your image of braiding various Indigenous worldviews into existing institutions to transform the mainstream. The change has to be at that deep level, or else it's a setup for ongoing assimilation, I think. Sybil and Louise, thank you, Ardyth! Exclamation mark. Do you know how much has changed since 1985? Are there still problems with women and their children getting their status?
Thanks, Sybil and Louise. Thank you for being here today. No, I don't. I know that with MacIver, things started to change. One of the things I meant to touch base on and just rolled over was the fact that back in 1985, when the Act changed, a big part of the concern in First Nations communities was that there are limited resources. And if you have an influx of women who have been excluded and their families, then those resources become even more tight. Now, so the Department of Indian Affairs did provide some additional funding for housing, but as you can well expect, the resources remained pretty strained. And I'm advised by my cousin that over the years there have been more people who are affected by the discriminatory sections allowed into the communities and allowed into the band rolls. But then again, the land base is not expanding. The resources are limited. So that remains a challenge. After 1985, as I mentioned, most of my activity became work in the feminist community and in expanding the impact of the Charter of Rights. So I'm not the person to provide any further insight other than that original struggle. I'm sure there's somebody who is keeping track of it, but it is not me.
Thank you. Margie Gilmore asks, what concrete actions can we take as the community of Gabriola to work towards reconciliation?
Oh boy, thank you, Margie. As I started out talking about the acknowledgement and how important I think that is, I know that my husband Dave and I struggle with how can we do more than just acknowledge? I mean, does that become just lip service? What are the concrete things that we can do to put some flesh on that, those words? And one thing I think is just by consistently doing it and considering what it is that you can do in your everyday life to make that more real. Now, I have a number of thoughts about this, and perhaps this is a question for the non-Native people listening. But one of the things that I'm aware of is when I bring up an issue of concern, it's very often the case that people say, oh, no, it couldn't be racism. No, you got that all wrong. And in fact, I recall a year ago or so, I was at a store in Nanaimo, and I was doing a return. I picked up something for my friend Marianne, and I had to do the return because it was not the right thing. So I went with my receipt and did the return, and the sales clerk was just nasty to me. She couldn't be any nastier. It was as though I had stomped on her tulips or something. It was terrible. But I had things to do. When you go to Nanaimo, you got things to do. So I had asked her to let me out of this area where I was doing the return, and she grudgingly let me out. But just before I got out, I saw that she had not credited me properly. So I returned and said, you haven't given me enough money. And she says, oh, well, that's because you bought other things. I've done what I have to do. And I said, well, no, there were two of those and you've only credited me with one. So by then she's really, really cranky and rude to me. And so off I go, got to hit Costco or wherever I was going that day. So I got all my money and away I go. Days later, I thought, oh, I hadn't thought of it at the time, but perhaps that was racism. And because there was no reason, I had the receipt, I had the information, I had, the right bag, I had everything that a clerk could want, but still she was very nasty to me. So I explained this to my friends when I was having dinner with them that night. The three people I love most on this island are having dinner. Wow. And these are people who know me, who love me, who trust me. And they could not conceive of the fact that I had endured any racism. I'm sure she was just having a bad day. I don't think she meant anything about it. She simply, it was just a mistake. And so what I urge is when you see racism or when somebody tells you about racism, going back 50 years, believe me, it's racism. I have experience with racism in a way that you don't, but I think a lot of white people don't want to believe that there is racism out there. And so I ask you, one, to believe our stories when we tell you something is racism. The other thing that I just wanted to touch on, I have a number of things that I considered when I was thinking about a Gabriola audience. And one of the things I'm thinking about is I think we should all consider how we make the acknowledgement more than lip service. But how about some of these ideas as well? How about we do more talks like this? How about we integrate more Indigenous life into the institutions of Gabriola? For example, One Book, One Community. I mix these up now. One Book, One Community. Yes, that was the one where Robert Joseph was going to speak in the springtime, and we had to cancel that because of COVID. So I think that's an excellent opportunity. Do more of those sorts of things. But the other thing that I was thinking of recently, I shared this with Carol yesterday, is in Gabriola Reads. Last year, we had the excellent presentation by Chris Straw on one of the Wagamese books. And it fills my heart thinking about what a wonderful evening that was. But how about we have Chris Straw return when we're allowed to return, but have four Indigenous people along with Chris Straw defend 4 books by Indigenous authors so that we have an impact on our community, and we have more knowledge in our community by 5 times what we had before. There's another thing, and I don't mean to in any way insult anybody, because I'm going to talk about art, and as we all know, that's a question of taste. I recall last year, social media, somebody was on about putting what I consider to be a really ugly statue at the entrance to the ferry. It was a gnome that was coming from Up Island. To my taste, it was crushingly ugly. And, you know, I agree that our art should reflect who we are in the island. I hope it's not that ugly gnome, but that was the heartfelt desire of some of the people who were commenting. To my way of thinking, what I would prefer would be, let's say, a partnership. If Snuneymuxw, and we all know how busy First Nations are, if Snuneymuxw has the time, a partnership to create welcome figures along the line of Simon Charlie's welcome figures from the Provincial Museum. Do any of you remember those? Beautiful, huge, simple welcome figures. And I think how much nicer I would feel, I think other people would feel too, if as people got off the ferry, they saw Coast Salish welcome figures in recognition of the fact that this was Coast Salish land, and that this community is copacetic with acknowledging that that is, that's what we are, that's who we are. That's so much more than just saying the words of acknowledgement. It's making concrete the acknowledgement as well. So those are some thoughts I have just off the top of my head. Another thought I had in addition was something we discussed when I was with the City of Vancouver's Council Committee on Urban Natives. We talked about things like place names, and I think about, maybe it was Calgary that has Blackfoot Way, or, you know, whatever. So street names are named after the tribes. And I'm thinking about the propensity to name things after dead white men. Well, why not put names on this island of streets that are, or places that are after our heritage, our people? For example, and I don't know what the dynamics are, but if the new housing development that is taking place was able, why not have First Nation names? Get Gary Manson over here and help name whatever streets or whatever are happening there. Why not have, and I would take advice from Geraldine and Dave on this, but why not have replicas of the petroglyphs also placed in positions of prominence like that, so that what we do is we recognize the Indigenous heritage in very concrete ways. So those are some of the things that come off the top of my head about how we expand the acknowledgement of of our heritage here on this island. Oh, another one, for example, is I was looking at, because I always lose my poppy. I mean, I lose my poppy 3 times a day and then go out again, have to buy more poppies and sort of thing. But I would love to have a beaded Indigenous poppy that I could wear for the rest of my life. And I was thinking, I haven't found one. I see pictures of them. I try. I'm picky about quality, so I want it just so. But why not have an art show once a year of Indigenous art here on the island? Because God knows we have lots of artists, but I think it would be a wonderful offering out to Indigenous people to actually also honor our art as well as the art just of the people who currently live here. So those are some thoughts.
Those are some pretty awesome thoughts, Ardyth. And we need to have some serious conversations because you're touching on a lot of things that are in conversation on Gabriola right now. So this is really fantastic. We have quite a few more entries in the group chat. So let me just relay those to you. Laura Jean Kelly, thanks, Ardyth. There's so much to digest here, and I have lots of food for thought. I look forward to more discussion and reconciliation. Martine Charles, thank you so much, Ardyth. I feel touched by your sharing. Dave actually said he can share a bit of example of status obtaining from family members. So let's turn it over to Dave to talk about that.
Awesome, thank you. And good words, Ardyth, when you say about the poppy. I have a picture of one right here. I have friends that make them. So, okay, but a little bit of the positive news when you were saying about sometimes it is still difficult for people to obtain their First Nation status, even when they know where they come from, who they are and where they come from. But a success story in Snuneymuxw here, about 3 years ago, I had 11 nieces and nephews all apply. They wanted to send all their applications in together, but the Department of Indian Affairs said everyone has to send their individual application. So I helped build their family trees for them all because their grandfather was a first cousin to my mom. And by doing that, putting pictures on their family trees and every one of them, they were all able to send in their applications within a short period of time. And just last year, the news came back that all 11 of them had obtained their status. So it was really exciting news because that's very rare for that to happen. Because it was the genealogy part is so important to have that, because you're basically building a case for yourself if you know of anyone who is trying to obtain their First Nation status or doesn't know how to go about it. That's what I'd learned. So good things with that. And I was agreeing with Ardyth when she was saying about putting some welcome figures or something. Bo and I had already talked about that, and we're working with the school on Gabriola to see if we can do something like that at the school. So some exciting things coming in. And then the book that we'd mentioned earlier called the Snuneymuxw People. I don't know if anyone's seen this book here, but it's the name of the Snuneymuxw people, which is down at what's that little dock called that's right by Mudge Island there? There's a little area, there's a
Verano?
dock. Sorry?
El Verano?
Oh yeah, that's right. Yeah, on the back on Alvarado. That's where that village site was at, and this was dug up there, and this was made out of coal, 2,500 years old. And I would love to see some sort of a sign there recognizing that this is where the people came from. But little things like that, I'm working with Snuneymuxw also, with lots of other areas like that. But I wanted to just touch a little bit on it about the success story of people obtaining their First Nation status. A good solid way to help in reconciliation is continue to ask questions. Put ourselves in an uneasy position. Sometimes it's difficult to do that, but to ask questions. We're going to learn. It's got to be a dialogue between First Nations and non-First Nations in order for there any kind of reconciliation to happen, because we've got a lot of information that we would like to share, but when people ask questions, it gives us a direction of where to bring the answers to. I'm hoping that's helpful. So thank you so much for that opportunity.
Thank you, Dave. We have a few more messages and questions for Ardyth. Deborah Lazar, a few of the books quoted by Ardyth are available on Audible books as well, and they're great for walks. Frida Woodruff Grammett, love the book presentation idea. I think she's referring to the Gabriola Reads. Sybil and Louise, yes to welcome figures. Louise Emmer, and willing to pay for them. So a comment that you made referencing back that someone's got to be willing to pay for them. Dave said that would be awesome. Laura Jean Kelly, love the idea of welcome figures. Heather Menzies, love the idea of making concrete the words of acknowledgement. It takes it from the passive to the active. Thanks, Ardyth. Louise Emmer, great to rename Twin Beaches and El Verano back to their original names. Jennifer Laidley, First Nation street names would be great. I have one street name to suggest for changing. Anna Paletta. Anna, thank you, Ardyth, so much for sharing your experience and thoughts. I am richer for it. Andrea Nunes, much appreciated for this talk. Anne Landry, Ardyth, thank you very much for your sharing. Are there things you think of we could do on Gabriola related to the land to help reconciliation?
Well, let me share with you my first Gabriola meeting. As I mentioned at the beginning, I'm essentially quite shy. And when I moved here 20 years ago, I kind of sat under the radar. But my first public meeting was at the Aggie Hall. Some of you might have been there. And it was about the purchase of the treaty lands for potential use with Snuneymuxw's treaty resolution. And I recall there, somebody stood up and said, well, if these Indians come, the price of our land's going to go down. What are we going to do about that? We can't have these Indians moving in because our land values will go down. So that put me even further into the idea that I should just stay under the radar. In terms of how to integrate it over the land, I think some of the land issues are being dealt with just in piecemeal. For example, there are Dave and Kate's initiatives at the schools. And I think the school is critical because, for example, you hear stories of people, young people damaging things in the community or not showing respect to things in the community. But I think that the more we have our children here know that the landmarks, the Indigenous landmarks, and any landmark is here to be respected, I think is an important first step. And Dave, you have, more information on what some of those plans are. I also am greatly enthused by the idea of the work Geraldine wants to do at the museum and in creating that amphitheater with the petroglyphs and stories. I noticed somewhere in Souk, I think it was, where there are outdoor storyboards around their museum so that you don't need to go into the museum. You can be outside and take a look at the story that's currently being told there. I think those sorts of things around the island are useful. As to specific land-based projects, nothing is jumping to my mind. I should say, though, that I'm only one person, and I think that brainstorming with Snuneymuxw on how they want to reflect their culture here is a critical first step. And some of the ideas I've mentioned, some of these concepts are ones which I think we Gabriolans should do with Snuneymuxw as they have the appetite and the time to do it. And I think that an important part of reconciliation is creating those partnerships, building those bridges across to Nanaimo. And those are bad words here in Gabriola, but this is a good kind of bridge, I think. Other than that, nothing is jumping out to me. Though I think one other thought that came to mind, and that was the very small picture I showed of myself when we were talking about marriages. That was actually a picture at my marriage. And what we did here, some of you were there, some of you know this, but what we did was we had a marriage on our front deck. That's a whole other story. But what we did was we called witnesses. My chief from Sauk, my Indian chief cousin, came up and performed the wedding ceremony. And we paid witnesses, and we paid our cooks. We did things in a community way. And my girlfriend Sheila, who was emceeing at the time, was so enthused about this. She said, "This is reconciliation," because we had all these white people and some Indians, and everybody was sort of participating in what we decided was to be our marriage. And I think that the everyday we can weave the everyday into our Indigenous experience. I'm not saying that white people should make up Indigenous experience, but I do think that building bridges with Indigenous people, with Snuneymuxw, as we're in Snuneymuxw territory, is a critical thing. And I think that is the path to reconciliation. Dave, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, so true. Very, very good word. What I often share when I do tours on Gabriola is the people that have had the opportunity to come on one of my tours to the petroglyphs or even to the reserve, is I always say that because we don't have anyone living on Gabriola from Snuneymuxw, other than Ardyth being a family member, we ask that people be our eyes for us, that they watch around the neighborhood. If they see things going on that shouldn't be, that they report it to someone rather than just allowing it to happen, because we haven't got anyone that lives on it right now. But it would sure be nice to hear from people saying that we've got recorded down someone's license plate number because there's something was going on wrong in a way. Not to try and be the police, so to speak, but just to be those eyes, because we're all working towards this reconciliation, and until we get someone that's located on the island, and hopefully I'm going to be one of those people that too. That's my long-term vision, is moving to the island and retiring on the island. Although I don't think I'll ever retire. I'll continue doing the work I'm doing as an artist until I'm not able to move anymore. So, but I'm always looking for opportunities to meet people in other areas of industry or other areas of interest that we may be able to call upon them, or we may be able to be of assistance in working with them in the future. So we may not know right now that we're going to need them, or they're going to maybe need us, but it's about that open communication, as with my tours all the time, of looking for those people that stand out among the crowd, so to speak, but always being open to whatever the situation is, and going there with an open heart is a big key for me. So Haichika, thank you.
Couple of more comments. Anna Paletta, would it be possible to have the history of Snuneymuxw on Gabriola at the museum here?
I think that that's in the works. Geraldine would be the person to know more about that. Or Carol, can you add on anything there?
No, I can't, unfortunately. I'm not in the know. I should be. I'll get on that.
But the work that I'm doing with Geraldine, she's put my name forward in the administration at Snuneymuxw, that I should be on the Elders Advisory Committee because of the work that I'm doing on Gabriola. And building the amphitheater in the back of the museum is right along the avenue of work that I'm already doing with the children, and having that opportunity to teach and share stories and legends with the youth that are the next generation, is influencing them in a very positive way. So the museum's doing quite a lot of work in preparing for that, for future gatherings for the next generation. It's in the works.
Excellent. Margaret Gilmer wanted to say, thank you, Ardyth. I learn something every time I listen to you speak. And she said, thank you to me for organizing this series and to allow us to keep the dialogue going. It's been incredibly beautiful to have these presentations and learn so much along the way. Gloria would like to say, thank you, Ardyth, for this important and heartfelt sharing. And Heather Menzies, sorry I have to leave. I've really enjoyed being part of this circle. Thanks, Ardyth and Carol, for organizing this. Stay well, all. Did you have any other comments, Ardyth, before we wrap this up?
Let me just see. I suppose not in well, no, I think I've covered everything I had in my additional notes. No, I think I'm good. I appreciate all the comments about the various books that I mentioned earlier, because I mentioned those because they're germane to this particular topic, or as reference books. Anna, Mick, Cheryl, Dave, sorry if I'm missing anybody, are part of the Indigenous Book Club. And we have read many more books than just the ones that I've showed. But I think that that's another avenue for educating oneself about books by Indigenous authors, and just about the issues in general, and an opportunity for lively discussion as well. Typically, I would be saying, and we need more books by Indigenous authors, but I recently learned the library has only a certain capacity for that. So we do have to find ways of sharing information that aren't necessarily limited to what we can get out of the library. But hopefully great minds will think of something.
Well, thank you so much, Ardyth and Dave, for joining us today. And Ardyth, I'm going to virtually present you with a gift and a handshake. So it's going to come across. I have to put my video back on. So I will put my video up there, and here I am. And Ardyth, this is for you. Thank you very much.
Clayco. That's from my new channel side, Dave.
Can you do that again?
Clayco. Yeah. In addition to Heichka, when we're fishing, back when there used to be salmon, I tried to figure out what my Grandma Sue would do to welcome the fish. So we went out and caught 175 one day. And what I do is when the fish are landed, I say, "Hello, little fish. Welcome aboard. We're happy to have you. Clayco." Then I hit them over the head and kill them. Do it for every fish we land. And I figured that's something Grandma Sue would have liked to have done too. So that's what I do.
Excellent.
They're giving themselves for you for food to survive.
Exactly.
And Dave, thank you very much for supporting this. This is for you. Heichka to both of you.
Awesome.
And that's the end of our presentation this afternoon. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Remember, next Monday, we have Dave Bodaly with a culture talk, and he showed you some of the items that you'll be learning about next Monday, and I hope you all can join us. It's the same link that you have for today, so save that somewhere. If you forget where it is, send me an email and I'll send you the link again. Okay, everybody, enjoy your November afternoon.
Thank you. Clayco.